Namaskar and good morning. We are delighted to inform Symbiosis Law School Noida, in association with Lex Witness, India's first magazine on legal and corporate affairs, THS, the law firm, and Sadgamaya, presents knowledge series on law and justice. As part of the series, on June 20, 21st, June 26, 28, 2020, and July 4 and 5, 2020. Honorable Mr. Justice C.K. Thakkar, former Judge, Supreme Court of India, Mr. K.T.S. Tulsi, Senior Advocate and Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, Mr. Vikas Pahwa, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, Mr. R. Venkatramani, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India and former Member, Law Commission of India, Mr. Nitin Pradhan, Senior Counsel, High Court of Bombay, and Mr. Vikas Singh, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, delivered sessions respectively as part of Leave 1, Leave 2, and Leave 3. We commence with Leave 4, which consists of 2 sessions organized on July 11 and 12, 2020. We are delighted to inform that we have among us Mr. Gopal Sankaranarayan, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, to deliver a talk on importance of nuances in advocacy. The session would be moderated by Mr. Raj Kamal, Advocate on Record, Supreme Court of India. Over to you, Mr. Raj Kamal, and I welcome Mr. Gopal to the session on behalf of Symbiosis International Deemed University, thus Symbiosis Law School Noida. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Raj.
Thank you, sir. We are honored and privileged today to witness the webinar on the importance of nuances in advocacy by one of the most eminent constitutional lawyers in the country, Mr. Gopal Sankaranarayan, the youngest designated senior from Supreme Court in the last 25 years. Sir, on behalf of the organizers of Knowledge Series on Law and Justice, we welcome you and all the participants to the webinar. Before we begin, please let me announce the housekeeping rules for the participants. The session would go on for an hour and a half. The participants would put their question in the Q&A box and we would put it to Sir while he's addressing the topic. Please note that there will be a live question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So please press the raise hand icon and we'll put you in the queue and put live questions to Sir. We'll try to address as many questions as possible. Over to you, Sir.
Thank you so much, Professor Ravandare, for that introduction, and thank you, Raj, for having me. To those who don't know, Raj is an outstanding cricketer, and I happen to play on his team in the Supreme Court cricket tournaments. So when my vice captain gives me a direction, I can't say no, even if it's off the field. So I'm very happy to be here, all of you. Hi, Kumar, and thank you for having me. I just want to explain a little bit about the background of this topic, which is essentially about the nuances in advocacy. I've begun to feel over the last few years that with the advent of social media and a lot more attention being paid to the courts, to litigation and what the courts do, there seems to be polarizing of opinions with reference to advocacy and lawmaking. And I fear that sometimes is creating complications within our social discourse on issues of law and the Constitution. So we are not politicians or media or sports fans who think in terms of binaries, win or lose, for or against. It's not that simple. As lawyers, we deal with the magic of the Constitution, the complexities of Indian society, the many layers of the law, the myriad precedents that we have to go through, and of course, the beauty of the English language, which is at the heart of it. Most important of all, as advocates, it is our responsibility to take responsibility for India's future. Much of what the courts decide are questions that are supposed to last for a long time. As you know, in India's legal system, the larger the bench, the longer it's expected that what they lay down will hold. If that is so, there's an equal responsibility on our shoulders sometimes to think above and beyond just the facts of our case. If M.K. Nambiar and Setalvad, Nani Palkiwala, S.V. Gupte, all great legends, had been casual or irresponsible, if they had bothered only about the facts of their limited individual cases, maybe we would not have taken great strides as a nation as far as legal and constitutional development is concerned. A land dispute in Punjab would have remained just that. It would not have become Golaknath versus the state. A newsprint regulation issue would have remained that. It wouldn't have been about free speech. Bennett and Coleman wouldn't be the precedent it is today. A passport being withheld from the daughter-in-law of a former prime minister at that point of time, Maneka Gandhi's case, would not have come to lay down the contours of the vast liberties we enjoy today. And the judge's transfer in SP Gupta would not have led to the relaxation of the locus standi standard, so that we have these huge PILs answering many, many questions today. All of this has had much to do with the responsibility that lawyers have taken and of the nuances involved in each of the questions that arose in those cases. They took small limited cases and made the cases big. So a lot of that responsibility goes to the lawyers, and I would hearken that we recall that era and try and uplift ourselves of looking at limited lists and make it much larger than what it is, because I think our nation really needs that at this time. The people of this country need our advocates to be something more. We are not just taking polarizing or political views. We have to examine, we have to discern, we have to modulate, and we have to express. It's in that background that I wanted to discuss with you how nuance plays an important role in 4 big cases which has captured public consciousness and which have emanated from the Supreme Court. One of them has been decided, one of them was decided and has been reopened, and 2 more are pending. Now, we are all aware of the sub judice rule, and I will be very careful of that. So I'm not going to say what the position should be. I'm going to present the facts and the views that there are to help us all understand that it's not black or white. It's not black or white in any one of these cases, though it's always been portrayed to be that. So as lawyers, as law students, and please take it from me, all the students who are here, every one of us, lawyers, judges, every one of us, professors, we are all still law students. The day we cease to be law students, we can give up on ourselves in this profession. So for all of us law students, I just want to draw your attention to these 4 cases and how I believe there has been polarizing without understanding what nuance is in these cases. The first of these, even chronologically, is Puttaswamy. Now, Puttaswamy was a case that emanated by, initiated by a former High Court judge from Karnataka, challenging the Aadhaar program. Now, at the time that the challenge was placed before the Supreme Court, there was no law with reference to Aadhaar. It was just a program that had been rolled out. Mr. Nilekani had been put at the helm of it, and they were having enrollments across the country. Now, for many, Puttaswamy is treated as a case about, are you for Aadhaar? Are you against Aadhaar? It's not that in my view. It has much more nuance to it. And I think very often, I think we lawyers either don't discuss our personal journeys in these cases to some extent so that people understand exactly what the tugs and pulls are. So this is not an exercise in vanity. In each of these cases, I've had minor roles. But I want to mention about how, while being there, being in the ring and participating, you begin to see the granular aspects of it. So Puttaswamy started as a challenge to an Aadhaar program, which was not a law. At the time the challenge was brought, it was the UPA government which was there. And the objection that was taken, firstly, was, look, if you are going to invade the personal space of individuals, you need to have a law backing it. You don't have a law. The second argument that was taken was there is a fundamental right to privacy, and that right to privacy is being breached by the Aadhaar program because A, you are taking people's biometrics, that's their iris scan, their fingerprints, and you are not giving them proper information about how it's going to be used, how it's going to be stored, and how it's going to be shared. Now, these issues, while they were pending, the enrollments of Aadhaar were going on. The governments changed, the position remained the same, and the government was defending the Aadhaar program. A legislation came to be brought, the petitions were amended, and again it was pressed into service, saying now you have a law, but it still doesn't fulfill the requirements of Article 21. There were other arguments also, but a primary argument of 21. Now, the reason why I mentioned personal journeys is important is this, that when I was a law student, I remember that we had a professor in college called A.M. Bhattacharjee. A.M. Bhattacharjee was the former Chief Justice of Maharashtra. Very erudite, learned man, and he wrote 3 books, Hindu Law and the Constitution, Muslim Law and the Constitution, and Equality, Liberty and Privacy. Now this third book, I happen to read. I was never academic in college, and please don't go and explore what my grades were. But I happened to read that book because I was curious about constitutional law. I think maybe I was doing a project, so I was compelled to read it. And I found it very interesting that Justice Bhattacharjee made this point. He said, in the raft of cases from 1975 onwards, in the case of Gobind, and then in the many cases that followed it with reference to the right to privacy, including PUCL, Rajagopal, Mr. X versus Hospital Z, etc., the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that there is a fundamental right to privacy protected under Article 21 and has leaned on Kharak Singh for that purpose. But Bhattacharjee said, Gobind has made a mistake in saying Kharak Singh said that there is a right to privacy, because Kharak Singh did not say that there is a right to privacy. It said the exact opposite. It in fact rejected the argument that was premised on the right to privacy by a suspect who was subjected to nocturnal visits. Now, I found it curious and I examined it. And I found that Mr. Fali Nariman had taken the same view in an article he had published in the Indian Advocate sometime in 1975 itself. And he had said the same thing, and he said, Gobind may not be correct law, but I'm happy that that is the law, that there is a fundamental right to privacy. Now, I was appearing for the Center for Civil Society in the Puttaswamy case. And the position Center for Civil Society had taken was this, that there are millions of people who are not getting the benefits of the programs of the central and state governments because they don't have a clear identification mechanism. People fake ration cards, they fake licenses, they fake all other forms of identification we have. So the actual beneficiary is not getting it, and this is a racket that's been going on for years. So Center for Civil Society said that, look, if it is a program from which is emanating from the Consolidated Fund of India, the government on behalf of the public has a right to identify the individuals who are going to be the beneficiaries of that. And that is in public interest, because eventually it's the public's tax money that goes in the Consolidated Fund, is rerouted for these programs for the poor and the disenfranchised. And it's important for us to make sure it reaches them and doesn't get siphoned off by some middleman. But we can't make Aadhaar compulsory. Now, this is the nuance. So it is premised on the right to identity. So now you have a question of the right to identity versus the right to privacy of the same person, right? The person who is the beneficiary of that program has his right to be identified, and he also has a right to privacy that you may want to identify me for this program, but should you take my fingerprint or my iris? So the obvious question is, look, if you are government, what is a better mechanism you would use where you don't invade one of this person's rights to ensure that that is actually the person? With the developments in technology, this seemed to be a reasonable measure for the government to take. So the petitioner said you have to dump the Aadhaar program completely. The respondent government said Aadhaar will be made compulsory for everybody. We were in the middle, saying, look, we don't think you should dump it completely, but we don't think you can force it on people who don't want to choose or avail of a program of the government's. If I'm sitting at home, you can't come and tell me take Aadhaar. The same way that if I'm sitting at home and if I'm not running around outside, you can't come and tell me that you have compulsorily got to download an app on your phone for the purposes of the pandemic, right? There are balances that have to be maintained, and the governments have to figure out how that balance is to be maintained, and the courts will then adjudicate if that balance is maintained. Now, I was at that time, the present Attorney General was appearing for Center for Civil Society. So I suggested to him these articles of Professor Bhattacharjee and Mr. Nariman's. And using that, because the petitioners were arguing a right to privacy, the argument was taken from this side, saying if you're canvassing a right to privacy, please first establish that the Supreme Court has said there is a right to privacy. We have two cases. We found that even MP Sharma, an 8-judges decision, had seemed to reject the notion of there being a fundamental right to privacy. And we said, it's not that Center for Civil Society is saying that there is no right to privacy. The Center for Civil Society and the duty of any advocates or lawyers is to ensure that the correct position of law is placed before the court. If the petitioner continues to press this right as against all other rights available to him, then it is my obligation to say that there are 8 judges and 6 judges who possibly say there is no right to privacy. There may be subsequent smaller bench decisions saying there is a right to privacy, but you have to resolve this before you embark on an examination on whether there has been a violation of that right here. You have to first inquire and answer the question, is there such a right? That is how the case got referred to a larger bench. And of course, we're fortunate that Chief Justice Kehar was heading the bench, because it came up on a Tuesday, exactly about 3.5 years ago. And 5 judges sat, he looked around and he said, look, we are questioning the validity of the decisions of 6 and 8 judges. Why don't we sit as 9 judges? Now, obviously, Kumar and Raj and all of us who've been in the courts often know that the minute a judge says, let's send it to a larger bench, we know, acha, goodbye. It'll come after 2 years. It came the next morning at 10:30. Now, people underestimate the influence, the clout, and the power that a Chief Justice can exercise if he really wants to make a change. So for me, Chief Justice Kehar did a fantastic thing in next day constituting those 9 judges. He didn't waste any time. All the lawyers were already prepared with arguments. So he said, why waste our time deciding in 5, then sending it to 7, then sending it to 9? Let's just go ahead. We'll send it straight to 9 and answer it. Now, when it went to 9, the next day, it also makes a very big difference. And let's talk practically about this, on how the bench is constituted. The bench that was constituted for the 9-judge decision was so carefully calibrated to include many of the people who were steeped in constitutional law in their advocacy practices. And most importantly, after the hearing that went on several weeks, it's the first instance of a Chief Justice sitting in such a large bench, not writing a judgment himself. Remember, this is a Chief Justice. He can say, I'm going to write the judgment. All of you agree, disagree, give me your views, whatever it was. But he sat back. Everybody else wrote judgments. He didn't. He just joined his name to that of Justice Chandrachud's judgment. So, and for me, it's a path-breaking judgment, because 9 judges gave a verdict which was unanimous. We've seen with Keshav Nanda and Golaknath how a 7-6 split can cause confusion about what actually the ratio of the judgment is. Indra Sawhney, even today, we're still culling out ratios depending on how many went with the majority, right? But you have 9 different voices, all saying we have a fundamental right to privacy. All then talking about the nuances of what that fundamental right to privacy is. And it has far-reaching implications, because a question about a fingerprint and a iris scan became a question of much larger importance, because when the bench had to start deciding about the positioning of a right to privacy, they had to look at what all privacy means. Now it was no longer about Aadhaar. Now it was about informational privacy. It was about personal privacy. It was about sharing of your blood samples being taken your swabs from your mouth that's taken by hospitals and doctors, all of that gets encapsulated. And it also becomes an important question about options exercised by individuals, which is why it was critical that Justice Chandrachud mentioned this, and we should be thankful to him. In the first week of the hearing, Justice Chandrachud was summing up what privacy could possibly be. And he said, privacy could involve many things. It could be the clothes you wear. It could be your choice of food. Because remember, there was a big debate in Maharashtra, etc., about banning non-vegetarian food and this and that. And then he said, it could include sexual choice. And based on that, and based on arguments that were made thereafter, the majority in that bench said that sexual choice is a part of the right to privacy. The minute the majority penned that down in August 2017, the nail was put in the coffin of Section 377 in its application to the LGBTQ community. The 377 judgment of Navtej Johar that came later, even if it hadn't come, you had 9 judges of the Supreme Court saying, in majority, that sexual choice is a part of Article 21. The minute sexual choice is a part of Article 21, you can definitely not penalize it. You can, in fact, use that as a stepping stone to start claiming civil rights. The right of marriage, the right of adoption, all those other rights of succession, etc., can be used for that. So the reason why I'm going through this little history is to emphasize that it's not clear and direct when you deal with these cases that it is for or against. It's not for or against other. It's not for or against privacy. It's not for or against the question of sexual choice or anything else. It's not that. It's about when you're going to fit something in. Remember 9 judges? Remember its interpretation of Article 21. It's the largest bench ever constituted for interpreting the most core of our rights. What is it that we as lawyers can do in assisting that bench? The biggest stain on the history of the Supreme Court was what happened during the emergency with the ADM Jabalpur judgment, specifically with reference to this one right, 21. So we fortunately had Justice Chandrachud overruling his father's judgment in that, right? So these are opportunities that lawyers must seize to understand that when things are opened up for you, grasp it, go ahead and try and explore for yourself what else you can do with it. So the next time you're dealing with a small bail case, remember it may not be a small bail case. There may be something which allows you to challenge a provision of the CRPC. It may allow you to pitch it on Article 21. It may take you all the way back to Puttaswamy and the contours laid down for it. So I'm using this as an example, yet again, PILs get a bad name. Puttaswamy was one big PIL, which has helped us re-appreciate and understand the width of our fundamental right under 21. Now, I've said at the outset that I'll take questions as and when rather than wait. So, Raj, Kumar, if you have any questions which have come in.
Sir, we will take the questions in some time, sir. 15.
Okay, cool. Okay. So the second case, again, dealing with nuance, is Sabrimala. Now, Sabrimala has been treated largely, again, by the media and by people who are trying to understand the debate as a clear case which is about, are you for women or against women? It's become a situation where you're accused of being chauvinistic if you have said that, no, there should not be the temple entry for women. But let's just understand what that Sabrimala case was about. There is a legislation passed by the state of Kerala. It's called the Hindu Places of Worship Act of 1965. That act applies to Hindu places of worship in Kerala, right? It's a legislation of the state of Kerala. Hindu places of worship is defined in that act. There is under that act also the Kerala Hindu Places of Worship Rules 1965. Those rules, in Rule 3 specifically, provide for the people who can access the Hindu religious places of worship. The background for that legislation is Article 25 of the Constitution, which specifically singles out, at the time that the Constitution came in, specifically singled out Hindu places of worship, necessarily allowing entry to all of its classes. It used to be a huge problem, as we know, pre-independence. I mean, Ambedkar has talked about it, Gandhi has talked about it, about how if you belong to certain of the backward classes or the scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, you were excluded from entering the temples. So this was to get over that. Even the explanations to sub-articles to Article 15 talk about that, about access to bathing ghats, wells, etc., because classes of Hindus used to be excluded from that. So Article 25 said specifically with reference to Hindus that you should have all classes of the Hindus having rights of entry to the world. So the act is fine. The rules specified what are the types of people who are allowed entry into those Hindu places of worship. One of those clauses, 3B, Rule 3B, specifically said that women who have customarily not been allowed to enter will not be allowed to enter. Now, the colloquial understanding of that is menstruating women were treated to be polluting, and therefore their access to the places of worship on those days would be prohibited. So the implication of Rule 3 was taken to be that. Barkha Dutt, the journalist, wrote an article about it, which came in a newspaper 20 years ago. That article was used as the basis for a PIL that was filed in the Supreme Court. Notice was issued, the case went into cold storage, and then was revived a few years ago for hearing, and referred to a constitution bench on the larger issues of rights of women into the temples. Now, at the end of the day, there are two important questions to consider. Three, in fact. The first, can a person who does not belong to that community or that religion or that religious denomination canvass in public interest a right of entry for others? Remember that faith is such a subtle thing that I can't decide for Raj about his entry to a temple if he doesn't want to go. But I file a petition saying Raj wants to go. Raj is saying, no, I don't want to go. The second issue is, that's about whether there should be a PIL in such cases. The second issue is, this is dealing with the virus of a rule. So it wasn't a general philosophy saying, look, they should all go. It was about one specific rule and should it stand or fall. Now, if you have to hear arguments on that, you can't pin it on one temple in the entire state of Kerala. This is a rule that applies to all the Hindu religious places of worship in Kerala, in which case all the Hindu places of worship have to be made parties and have to be heard. It's a fundamental aspect of natural justice, right? But you pinned it on Sabrimala, made Sabrimala the only party, and Sabrimala had to bear the brunt of it. Third, and this is for me the most important thing, when should a court start stepping in into aspects of personal practice of a particular faith? Because the danger of stepping in at this stage would mean that it can entertain tomorrow a PIL at the hands of a Hindu saying who should enter a mosque, at the hands of a Muslim about who should enter a church, and who should take up the cloth, who should offer service on Sundays, right? And then you have to decide at what stage will this stop. Now, these are choices which faiths make, and if you don't leave religions to reform from within, and you start bringing courts into it, remember that Articles 25 and 26 allow the governments, that is the state, to make law in the interest of public health, morality, etc., to in any way correct any grievances that the members of the faith may have, in the interest of public health, morality. But can the court step in using that basis? Can the court tomorrow step in using the restrictive grounds under 19, 2, 3, 4, and 6 to start restraining individuals' free speech? Or isn't that the job of the state? So a fundamental question is, where do you draw the contours of how the court will embark and step in. So it's not only a question of are you for or against women. We may be as feminist as possible, but as lawyers, our role is to understand that, look, there is a rule, that rule has been challenged, and what is the aspect of that in this particular context. Now, one of the fundamental arguments that was taken was that Sabrimala is a temple that is open not only to Hindus, it's open to Muslims, Christians, many of them do come. There is a lieutenant, a Muslim lieutenant whose statue is there, and his little shrine is there at the bottom of the Sabrimala steps. And Sabrimala devotees are supposed to offer worship there before they climb up. So Muslims come there in droves, so do Christians, people of all faiths come there in droves. If they do come there in droves, can this particular temple be said to fall within the definition of Hindu place of worship? Because it's not only about the deity, it's about how the temple has deported itself towards people over the years. And if over several hundred years you have permitted people of all faiths to come, for you now to say it's only a Hindu place of worship means by implication that the Supreme Court is taking a decision to exclude devotees of other faiths, which was never the claim in the petition, so that you can allow women to enter. So there is a nuance here. It's not pro-women against women. It's about faiths and their devotees. We know that there are temples, especially in many parts of the South where I hail from. You have a temple for Jayalalitha, you have a temple for Michael Jackson, you have a temple for Pillai, right? I mean, there must be hundreds of temples for Sachin Tendulkar. Now, if they decide to set up that temple, and a small denomination of people say, we'll all call ourselves Sachins, and these are the only people who will enter that temple. And if you have to enter the temple, you have to pad up and carry a bat. Imagine that. I mean, we can't say that our constitution and our founding fathers were so confined in their minds and their imaginations that they did not contemplate the possibility of certain imaginative faiths coming up later. All of this can happen. You can't say that we have a cutoff line and there are only the great faiths of 2000 years ago that will prevail. Nothing else can come. So if something like that were to happen, can the Supreme Court step in and say, no, allow him to enter the temple with only one pad? I'm sorry, these are my rules. You don't want it, you set up another temple where you'll wear both pads or one pad, whichever way it is. So I think these and other questions are what in the review they have thrown up and set up for a larger bench to decide. And that larger bench will now go back and reconsider the correctness of the Shirur Mutt case from the late 50s, which talked about how you interpret Articles 25 and 26, about the secular nature of religions and how, with reference to the secular nature, the state can intervene, possibly even the court can intervene. But at what stage and how? All those contours are up for discussion now, because the Supreme Court in the review stage last year had said, look, we feel that there will be commonality with Muslim women of entry into mosques and dargahs, Parsi women entering the Agyari if they have married a non-Parsi, the Dawoodi Bohras and what is known as female genital mutilation, though the Dawoodi Bohra community believes that it's not mutilation. Now all these issues are up, and all this has been caused and run out of the Sabrimala issue. So I would say that we must not hasten to make these cases about binaries, that you're for or against. It's not. It's actually much more nuanced than that, and we have to be aware of the consequences to our state, to our proclaimed secular state, of a arm of the state, which is the judiciary, stepping in and deciding in a paternalistic fashion what the contours of a particular faith should be. I'm not saying that women should not have the right of entry. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that obviously they have grave rights to be there. But if the faith hasn't evolved in some way, and if we are going to say that courts themselves should have the say in doing this, maybe it is a good thing in one direction, because at some point we'll reach a uniform civil code through the courts, if not through parliament. because eventually the courts will use the constitutional morality principle that they have evolved over the last few years, and they've used that by reading morality in Article 25 to mean constitutional morality, and constitutional morality compulsorily means the values held in Article 14 and Article 19 and Article 21. And therefore, if Article 14, equality, is one of the aspects of morality in Article 25, then obviously women's rights, transgender rights, all those rights will also come in. It's, I think, a healthy point of debate. I mean, I have a particular position because I'm instructed in a particular fashion, but I think as students of the law, we must understand that there are many, many strands to this, and it's exciting times. I mean, it's great that this generation has been put in charge, because I think most of the people who are going to be working on these cases in a big way are the interns and the students and the juniors and the young lawyers who are really going to put together the mass of thought on these issues for many years to come. God knows when the next time the 9 judges decision in Sabrimala, whenever it comes up, will be up for challenge or reconsideration. So we are fortunate that you're living at this time. So shall I proceed to my next? Oh.
No, sir. With your permission, I'll ask a few questions.
Yeah.
Sir, so Mr. Satyaprakash, he asked a question that I'll quote: "Religion has existed since time immemorial. Indian state as a constitutional entity is just 70-year-old. India is witnessing a spate of dispute between religion and state. Do you think we have the constitutional framework to deal with relationship between religion and state? Should it be reworked?" This is the question, sir.
Well, like I said, I think this 9 judges decision will go a large way in, I don't know about reworking, but I think reappreciating and understanding what the contours are. I feel that while religion is extremely old, I think the constitution at that given point of time, when those people were much more aware of religious polarities than in possibly any decade since. We talk a lot about the Ram Janmabhoomi riots. We talk a lot about what's been happening in the last few years with reference to cow slaughter and stuff. But I mean, I don't think we can compare that with the national consciousness at the time of the freedom struggle, when we lost millions in partition and in Bengal. So I think we were very, very clear as our founding fathers were concerned about the importance of trying to bring these various strands of faith together and trying to govern them under a single constitution. I think the values which are underpinning the constitution are great. I think, however, the steps that we have taken immediately after independence requires a very serious reappreciation. I think the state took many steps getting into the arena of religion and playing politics with it, okay? And that happened right from the 1950s. From the Nehruvian age till now, that has been a serious issue. The fact that we allowed a state to decide on the reformation of only one religion out of all others and came up with the draft Hindu Code Bill, and then the Hindu marriage, adoption, maintenance, succession, all those legislations in the 50s, but you didn't touch any of the other religions. For me, that's a problem. If you're a secular state, either you go the whole hog with all faiths or stay away from all of them. In many states, in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, and Orissa, and Andhra Pradesh, and even in Maharashtra, you have these legislations of the states which have essentially taken over places of worship. There are Devaswam boards, and they appoint executive officers who will run those temples, and a large amount of the revenues go to the state. Now, if you're going to do that with one place of worship, you got to do it for all faiths, right? I'm as secular as they come. I'm somewhat agnostic on many things. And I feel that as a constitutional governed state, we have to stay away from religion. Our leaders over the last 70 years have, I think, pretty much failed us in that respect. And let's not hold our punches on that. They have absolutely failed us. They have used religion and they have used caste as aspects of political mileage without really doing anything for the people when it mattered. So I think we are in a morass there, but I think it would be a great time for reform if the state would just step away.
Thank you, sir. So one another question which is concerning the Sabrimala case is that what according to you should be the extent to which the court can inquire into the issue of whether a particular practice is an integral part of the religion or religious practice for a particular religious denomination? Or should that be left exclusively to be determined by the head of the state, head of the section of that religious group, sir?
No, I mean, that's an excellent question. And that is one of the questions that's been referred to the Constitution bench. So, like I said, that's an aspect that's sub judice today. We can have different opinions about it. We don't know what's going to finally come out of it. I would just say that if you leave certain things completely to the heads of the faith, then you have to consider what that could be, right? If you have a aspect of human sacrifice or animal sacrifice, is that okay? Would you leave that to the head of this thing without the court stepping in or without the state stepping in? So if that is the test to be used, if we are going to use the essential practices test at all, or are we going to evolve something else out of it? It is a test that has existed for many years, but today it's up for revision. So I would say I would be a little cautious about leaving everything to the head of the faith, because there may be many things that cause harm to third parties, to people who can't consent. Because one of the things that is again up is about small children who are less than the consenting age, about either mutilations or circumcisions or any fundamental physical alterations to their bodies to which they can't speak. And you get maybe a parent or a guardian to speak for it. But when they attain majority and they say, hey, this is irreversible, what am I going to do now? Right? So those are questions worth asking. And I think we must reflect and discuss that more. And possibly when the time comes, the court will give us a verdict.
Sir, thank you, sir. So one of our professors, Professor Meera Matthew, she asks a question that PIL is for public interest, but when it says that only believers or affected parties could have moved against Sabrimala ban on women, don't you think such argument loses the very purpose of PIL, sir?
No, so thank you, Professor, for that question. I think it's worth reflecting on, and that's also one of the questions that's been referred to the Constitution bench, whether you can have public interest litigations with reference to religion. It's not a question about public interest litigations per se. We all know that it's there, and we're hoping that it'll be there for the long run. But in matters of religion, for example, can you have a public interest litigation about the way a parent is bringing up his child in a neighbor's house? Now, you may not agree with it. It may not be the way you would bring up your children. But as long as he's not in any way contravening the law or bringing harm to a child, the way he's bringing up the child may not be ideal. But can you use that as something to give you locus standi to proceed against that neighbor? I think the same principle applies here, that you decide as not belonging to that faith that I want to bring in a petition on behalf of the devotees of that faith. The question is, if those devotees are affected, surely they can bring it themselves. Is this something that is subject of external reform? I'm not saying it is or it is not, but I think there is clearly a question that has to be answered about the contours of PILs. Very often we find PILs being brought in cases which appears that somebody is shooting over their shoulders. It's being brought, against a Congress incumbent by somebody who happens to have a lot of information about the files and how they moved, etc., etc. And there's a possibility it may be a political rival. Right? So you have those things. We've seen that over the years. So it's worth exploring. I think for me, my personal view is in matters of religion, either let the religion reform from within themselves, or allow the people who are affected from that faith to bring that case up.
All right, sir, I have one other question from Dr. Garima Yadav. She wants to know how to avoid or deal with overgeneralization or simplification of legal issues due to incessant media trials, which informs the majority. So what has been your experience and what is your view on this?
So I mean, let's take Dubey's case from yesterday, right? It's an encounter killing. We know it's an encounter killing. There's a huge conjecture among all of us, many of us in society, that even as of day before when he was arrested, there were many people saying, look, he's going to be knocked off. There's a petition filed in the Supreme Court day before night saying, please ensure he gets protection so he doesn't get killed, right? Now, it's polarizing. The minute you go out there and say that, look, rule of law has been violated, you'll have people reacting and saying that what happens about those 8 policemen who died, right? But if you go into the nuance of this, there is something very important. It is that we do have a rule of law at the end of the day, right? That rule of law applies to Dubey, applies to the 8 policemen who died. It applies to the policemen who killed Dubey. It applies equally to the 50 victims that Dubey apparently had before these 8 policemen were killed. And the questions that arise as to how he was at large for so many years and who was sponsoring and backing him. It's in each of these cases, if you draw it out completely in detail, you know, it's like a web that expands. You begin to see it much more clearly. So if you see it much more clearly, that rule of law, this is not a human rights argument alone. I mean, it's pejorative nowadays to refer to this as human rights. This is a clear question of a homicide that has taken place under Indian law, whether you like it or not. There's not one, but there are, I think, 6 homicides that have taken place after the death of those 8 policemen. Because all these guys have been knocked off in encounters. There are 8 homicides that took place of those policemen. There are 50 homicides before that. These are questions that the state needs to answer. Because if you have nearly 60 deaths happen in homicides, I think it's clear that there has been lapses, deliberate action, which makes us as a society question that if we are to allow this to continue, where is it going to stop? Tomorrow it can be our cousin or our uncle or somebody who gets knocked off, and then we are not going to be asking those questions. We have to therefore stick to some core basic values that we all feel are important for us, and project it, notwithstanding the fact that in social media people have polarizing views. On general media, you have one Times Now taking one position, one Republic taking another position, and NDTV taking a third position. I mean, it's clear that there are these very lineated positions. But as educated people going into what is, I still believe, one of the most honorable professions in the country, it's for us to get into the granular details before we jump to giving our views.
Yes, sir, another question. Raj, I have another question. Dr. Madhukar Sharma wants to know that in these COVID days, if a COVID-infected person says that he has a right to privacy and his name should not be revealed, but the state keeps declaring his name and the people who are infected on the grounds of public safety. So he wants to know how these two rights can be reconciled.
Well, in my view, as of today, there is no law which permits this to be done. Puttaswamy was clear that if you are going to breach an individual's privacy, you have very strict principles to follow. You first need to have a law enacted. You then need to ensure that that law is both necessary and proportional. Now, if you are not able to meet the first test, which is a law, a legislation, specifically saying that because of the virus epidemic, etc., we will now be sharing the details of individuals who are afflicted with it, etc. If you don't have that law, let's not bother going further into the substance of whether it's necessary and proportional. It may well be, but you don't have a law. If you don't have a law, you're not permitted to do it, full stop. You can't use the National Disaster Management Act as a fig leaf for doing virtually anything you want and claiming that, oh, it's because of disaster management. Please remember, we're not even in the state of a national emergency. even in the situation of a national emergency, and that's what ADM Jabalpur tells us, that even in the situation of a national emergency, Article 21 is available to us. And the Constitution was amended to restore that position of law. Now, if Article 21 is available to me, my right to privacy is available to me. If my right to privacy is available to me in an emergency situation, you need to make a law even there. This is not even an emergency situation. So they can't get away by just saying that, "Acha, COVID hai, ye karo, wo karo." That's become a habit now.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
We'll take a few live questions.
Yeah.
Mr. Avinash Vaishan, can you ask a question, please?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the very
Yeah.
informative session.
Yeah.
My question, I have two questions. The first question is that how do you strike a balance between getting the individual relief for your client and as well as maintaining the bigger picture, as you said, like challenging a section or getting a relief that would essentially answer a question of law rather than just a question of fact, right? And the second question is somewhat concentrated, and the question is that do you think that the Sabrimala judgment as well as the Shaira Banu judgment was a missed opportunity in terms of getting religious rights and beliefs under the garb of the fundamental rights, specifically 14 and 21, when you see that 21 is one of the most important rights, and even that are curtailed, and even those rights are curtailed in the name of religious practices. So do you think that there was a missed opportunity on part of the judiciary to deal with this particular question?
Thank you for that question, Avinash. I'll answer the second question first. I don't think that was a missed opportunity, and I'll tell you why. Because religion has a very clear connotation. Now, even if you look at 25 and 26, they talk about three types of individuals: those who belong to religions, those who belong to religious denominations, and those who belong to neither. That's why they talk about freedom of conscience, because they're talking about people who are agnostic, who are atheists, who have nothing to do with religion. Now, if you were to elevate the right to religion to something under Article 21, it can afford very little exceptions. So you can't, for example, waive a fundamental right. That Basheshwar Nath has established that 60 years ago. So you can't, for example, tomorrow decide to give up your religion. And if you are not religious at all, how is it that you would not have that right? So it would be a little unnecessary, in my view, to elevate a right which has been given substantial recognition in not only the fundamental rights chapter, but in also the goals that we have in the directive principles. So I think the approaches in both cases were very different. Sabrimala's was a very specific case where they decided 4:1 on the fact that constitutional morality would infuse Articles 25 and 26. And they rejected the notion that the Ayyappa devotees were religious denominations in majority. But Shaira Banu is again, I think, I'll use that word again, it's nuanced, because you have 5 judges who arrive at different conclusions, arrive at maybe similar conclusions with very, very different reasoning, right? So Justice Joseph uses a reasoning which suggests that the court is wearing the garb of an ecclesiastical tribunal, which for me is not comfortable. It was not really for the Supreme Court to start behaving like a religious court, to go into edicts and texts and stuff like that. Justice Kehar's own view was different in that regard, and I think his would be the dissent if you look at his reasoning. So I don't see that in either of these cases as lost opportunity. So one good thing that does come is its interface, Shaira Banu's interface with manifest arbitrariness in Article 14, because in majority the bench, Rohinton Nariman and Justice Kurian, do in majority say that manifest arbitrariness is now a test for any legislation. I think that's a big development, because after the Code issue case and many other cases in the past, we've had doubts about that. Now it's something which is a third aspect of Article 14 that we can use for testing law. Oh, sorry, the first part of the question. I think it's not necessary that every case is forced to become a big constitutional case, but in difficult cases, in cases where you're really up against the wall and you're scrabbling to find a way out, usually the constitution could give you some recourse. Because that's why very often you find that, hey, you start thinking, why didn't we challenge this provision of the Bombay Land Revenue Code, Maharashtra Land Revenue Code? Because if you had challenged that provision, then maybe the order that was passed under it would be more vulnerable than it is now. So I think you have to leave it to your own judgment, because sometimes it may not work for your client if you get pushed off by raising big constitutional issues. He may want some relief immediately, and you're raising these big issues and it gets pushed off. And your client is not going to be happy with you. Your solicitors are not happy with you. So you have to take it case by case.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal.
Yeah.
Dr. Meenakshi Kaul, please ask your question live.
Yeah, a very good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the extremely informative, enjoyable, and overall a valuable session. My question would be, sir, Hinduism weaves a rich tapestry of numerous gods and goddesses that are worshipped in various ways. Like, if we take the example of Lord Hanuman, it's considered to be a Bal Brahmachari and hence restrict the entry of women into Hanuman temples. So it's also believed that women who enter this temple are cursed instead of being blessed. Now, who codifies this all? We don't have a written down law or rule as far as Hinduism is concerned. Now, why this discrimination when it comes to women? Secondly, do you really believe that the exclusion of women from the temples, is an essential religious practice in itself, or is it only a consequence of conventional morality?
Okay, I think excellent questions both. I'll again answer the second one, Doctor, first. Yes, I think that it is an aspect of conventional morality to exclude women. I obviously am not for it, but I think because of the width and the variety, particularly of the Hindu faith, because I don't think in many other religions you will find the kind of variety in forms of worship, in forms of obeisance, in religious practices, in the number of gods, and the kind of temples and the kind of practices that you find in the Hindu faith. So it's possibly a good thing that it hasn't been codified, because I think codification takes away sometimes from the sanctity of things. It's the same way why I don't think the Indian community really embraces, marital contracts, because it takes away from the sanctity of it. You expect that it's going to be organic and that it will change. It's not that temples in India, which have excluded one particular gender, have not changed to start allowing them in. It's just that some of them are well behind the curve on that, and obviously we hope that they would change. But if we were to impel or force that upon them, I think we might be on a slightly slippery slope, because the question would then be, where are we going to stop? I mean, from within the faith, I'm all for it. But I'm saying from outside, if you get either the courts or people not of that faith to bring those cases, then I think we are on a slippery slope. And I'm sorry, can I have that first question again?
Yes, sir. Just a moment, sir. Yeah, am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, so I was talking about, do you believe that the exclusion of women from the temple is an essential religious practice in itself, or is it only a consequence of conventional morality? One. Second, if you see that Lord Hanuman temple and Ayappa temple also at certain places, they don't allow the entry of women. They restrict the entry of women. So it's believed that because women who enter this temple would be cursed instead of blessed. So my question was, who's the person who codifies this? Who says this is right, this is wrong, this should be done, this should not be done? So why this discrimination when it comes to women? I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little bit feminist, but
no, this is absolutely reasonable. Let us understand that. Okay, it is absolutely reasonable. It must be lauded and supported. Let's understand that. That's what I'm talking about, nuance. I think most people on this panel, if not all, will agree to some extent that women should fully have all rights to enter temples and religious places of worship. And I'm pretty sure that if it were left to us and we were managing the temples, that would be the position. Unfortunately, we're not. People with different mindsets are the ones who are running these temples. I'll give an example myself. I hail from Kerala, in fact, coincidentally, but I've lived all my life in Bangalore and in Delhi. When my first child was born, we went to a Guruvayur temple. Guruvayur is the reigning deity of the Guruvayurappan temple in Kerala. It's Lord Krishna. And there is a Guruvayur temple in Delhi, in Mayur Vihar. So we took our little child there, and the child was, I think, 4 months old or so. And as we were entering, he wasn't even a priest, he was basically a hanger-on Malayali man sitting near the door, and he asked me, how old is the child? And I said, the child is 4 months. He said, you can't step in with that child here. So I asked him why, because I was unaware that this was a rule, but it was required. My parents had pushed me saying, please take the child to show Lord. And I realized, and this is something which is there in these rules of Kerala Hindu temple worship as well, that if you're less than 6 months old, you're not allowed entry into the temple. There is some idea that they have that until you're 6 months old, the child is itself a manifestation of God. So you don't take God to worship God, worship itself. So because of that peculiar belief, you are not allowed. Now, the man was fairly rude when he said, he spoke to Malayalam and said, you will not dare set foot inside it. So I turned to him and said, absolutely, why not? I mean, it's a child at the end of the day, wants to go and this day. And there was a bit of, resistance. And eventually I said, forget it. I don't want to get into this spat. And I left the child outside and I went in and said, whatever. Now, the problem is we often meet things like this. It's not codified in any specific manner. A lot of it is left to very orthodox individuals within temples who run it, for whom it's their daily bread. Right? They believe that they are the ones who control and rule that domain. So maybe it's not too much for them to ask, saying that we have certain precepts, you have to follow them. So I think, like you said, for each of these temples, it's different. And should it be codified? Should it not be codified? I think those are questions left to each single religious place of worship. It's obviously not a position which is ideal, and it's, like I said, not something that any of us really advocates that women should be excluded. But the question still remains that tomorrow it's not only about women. Tomorrow it's about communal cleavage. For me, it's a cause of grievous concern if tomorrow we have people really polarizing, extremist, unsecular, communal individuals filing petitions against each other, against each other's places of worship, right? So that it can become this battle which starts a conflagration right down the middle. So for me, that's possibly a bigger concern than the issue of a particular gender or a particular group being excluded from a temple. There are temples, by the way, in Kerala as well, where men are excluded. So it's not so much, like I said, about a woman issue really. It's about who is going to try and bring about these changes. Is it going to come from within the faith? Is it going to come from the state? Or is it in the last resort going to come from the courts? Anything else, Raj?
Yeah. There are many questions pouring in, and people want to ask live questions as well.
Yeah.
But I would only want your permission whether you would want to finish off first.
No, I can ask. You guys look at it and curate it. I have no problem. We'll...
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal. Ankit Tripathi, please ask your question live.
Yeah.
Ankit Tripathi, please unmute yourself and ask your question live.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, my question is with respect to, we have seen the extent of intervention by the courts in the religious matter, especially considering the Sabarimala matter. So my question is it the right time for us, especially the Supreme Court, to develop the doctrine of religious question on the line of doctrine of political questions that we have in India, so that we can have less intervention by the courts in religious matters, just like we have in the political matters?
Thank you for the question, Ankit. I think it will be difficult for us to do that. The reason is that the political question principle really finds its roots from the US Constitution and the laws that apply there. Now, the religious question issue could also take roots if you have a constitution which chose to sidestep all aspects of religion. In which case you could say, look, religion is outside the chapeau of this, so please don't step into it. The minute you do have religion, and you have religion not in one or two places, in several places. Even in Articles 15 and 16, when you talk about reservations, there's been this big debate whether the backward classes would also get reservations if they have converted to other religions. Or is it only for backward classes from the Hindu faith who would avail of it? It's a debate which still continues. You have the question of like you've seen right now, the question of standing up for the national anthem. The Jehovah's Witnesses didn't, and it was ruled in their favor, but that's also a question of religion. So the institutions which are minority institutions, both linguistic and religious, which have protections under the Constitution with reference to how they will admit students. We have a whole host of cases, Stephens, St. Xavier's, all of them, which have dealt with that all the way up to TMFI. So it's been a very strong aspect of our Constitution to deal with religion. We have placed the Uniform Civil Code as a constitutional goal, as an explicit constitutional goal. So I would think that while it's an interesting principle, I think it's extremely difficult when you are in the within the scope of a constitution that administers religion and deals with it specifically. I mean, if you look carefully, there's some provision in the Constitution which talks in rupee terms about the amount of money that will go to the Travancore Devaswam Board. So I'm saying, you know, this Constitution is as far away from the religious question element than anything. So it's very clearly steeped in many ways in religion and discusses it in big ways. So I would think it's very difficult for us to adopt that principle at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal. Mr. Vikram Singh, please ask your question live.
Thank you so much, sir, for permitting me. And first of all, I would like to thank sir for such a beautiful lecture. Sir, I am having two questions. But my primary question relates to advocacy at the trial courts, at the district level court. Most of the discussion has been on the practice at the Supreme Court. Right now, I'm having a very small question, and sir, the thing is this: that whenever at the trial courts, the advocates, they are trying to raise constitutional aspects. For example, there are two persons who are to be arrested, only one person is arrested, and suppose there is a situation of Article 14 being violated, that on the same facts the judge is taking cognizance upon one person, but other person is excused. So when this thing is being put before the judge or something like that, this is just for the sake of example, the judges, they are not taking the question within their purview. They are not taking the cognizance of this constitutional question. They say that this is not our purview, it is the constitutional prerogative of the Supreme Court, and if you wish to have any clarification, then you first go to the Supreme Court, have a clarification, then come to us. Now, what I have perceived over the years as a teacher and as a student of law, that is it not making the pendency of the courts increase? Because whatsoever is the problem, it is at the trial stage. And after years, it is reaching out to the Supreme Court, and many times, nearly, I would say rather 70% of the cases, nobody reaches to that stage of the High Court or the Supreme Court. So how far good is this constitutional law or this constitutional understanding which is prevailing in the academics, in the judges and in the legal society, that it is only the prerogative of the Supreme Court and only Supreme Court will deal it? And when I personally asked the judge, he said, Ki, beta, you know, as I was young at that time, he told me that if I am going to entertain this right now, I will be questioned by the High Court authorities. So why this kind of attitude is there? If you can throw some light. I know it is a bit complicated thing, sir.
No, it's not. It's not. It's fairly straightforward, and let me explain why. See, all authorities, state authorities, are supposed to ensure the application of the fundamental rights. Now, the problem is that because of Mirajkar's case in 1967, where they have excluded the judiciary from the definition of state for the purpose of Article 12, it is often felt that courts themselves cannot possibly be in violation of the fundamental rights. So in an approach where one feels that a trial court has violated Article 14, you have no avenue. You can't file a writ against the trial court. That's not available to you. It's because that is not available to you that even on the civil side, you can't really file a writ of prohibition against a civil court, even if it doesn't have jurisdiction. You file a revision, you try whatever else. The constitutional courts are the courts which can decide questions on the interpretation of the Constitution and whether a particular kind of writ can be issued in that consequence. That's why 226 and 32 are explicit. So in the kind of example that you gave, I'm not sure technically whether an Article 14 argument can be pressed, but I don't know the facts of your case, etc. But let's take it that it's two identically circumstanced individual in all manner, and yet arrest and action, initiation of prosecution is only against one. It would always be available to you to make an application to the trial court saying that taking only one argument, that it's discriminatory, it's selective, we feel it's motivated, and then get a dismissal of that application and then file a revision to the High Court or an appeal, whatever lies, and ask the High Court to exercise its jurisdiction, saying that it's a violation of Article 14 and see where it goes. But the reasons why subordinate courts, all courts, are hesitant on entertaining or administering Article 14 kind of arguments is that because we have for nearly 50 years taken the position that courts don't violate fundamental rights. Yeah, Raj?
Thank you,
Kumar?
Mr. Gopal.
Yeah.
Ms. Meera Matthew,
Sorry.
please unmute yourself and ask your question live.
Thank you, sir. My
Yeah.
question is pertaining to right to privacy. So, like you have already stated that right to privacy was declared as fundamental right in the case of Puttaswamy versus Rule of India. But my question is, without personal data protection bill not passed, do you think the privacy is safeguarded properly? What is your take on that?
I'm very clear that there has to be a data protection law in place for the right to privacy to have its full sway. I'm very clear on that. I've seen the bill. I think there are some problems with that bill, but it largely tries to address many of the safeguards that we need. I think it needs some changing. But once that bill is passed, you will hopefully have a legal basis to protect you when the government tries to in any way invade your privacy. Specifically in this COVID atmosphere, right? They ask you to download it's Arogya Setu, is that the name of the app? Yeah, the Arogya Setu app. And that, for example, is something that if they were to, and that's why they haven't really imposed it across the country. They impose it in certain quarters in small measures and try and see how it's going. So if you have to register in a government hospital, you have to download. Technically, you can object to that, but they are forcing you to make this trade-off. Now, you would be protected when you make that trade-off if we had that Data Protection Act in place. So in my view, you absolutely need it. Without that, you're not having the full sway of the privacy law.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal. Charvi Kumar, please ask your question live.
Good afternoon, sir. First and foremost, I have to say that I really enjoyed your lecture, and I think I might have a million questions, but I will restrict myself to one. And it has something to do with how the court decides to go into people's religious beliefs and decides to interpret it for them. So, for example, in the Sabrimala judgment, Justice Chandrachud said this very interesting thing. He said that it is irrational to believe that a god would cease to be celibate if he were to, see an attractive woman who was of that age where she's menstruating. Because if the god is celibate, the god will and should have enough self-control. And essentially, I believe in saying that he took someone's religious belief, no matter how irrational, and he kind of replaced it with his own religious belief. Can we do that? We can discuss the constitutionality, of course, but can he actually start questioning if the belief itself is rational or not? And related to that, even in the triple talaq judgment, one of the judges decided to quote extensively from the Quran. And I'm not sure if that had any place in case of constitutional law. What are your opinions on this, sir?
Well, I think I agree with you. I don't think Justice Chandrachud should have opined in that fashion of possibly expecting different values, his own values, from a deity which is as far as the faith is concerned supposed to have different value sets of its own. Remember that I think one of the reasons why the pantheon of ancient gods have had their own attraction is because of the number of flaws they have. Now, if it is a flaw for a celibate god to in any way be distracted or attracted by the female form, then yes, that is the human element of that god. We have seen Zeus in Greek mythology, Aphrodite in Greek mythology, Venus, and all of them had many, many failings when it came to this aspect of their lives. And yet they are venerated. They are treated as the pinnacle of the pantheon of gods that they have there. So it is problematic for individual ideas of what gods mean being attributed to them. Maybe from a critical standpoint, it is a failing of a particular god that he is not stronger when it comes to this aspect of attraction and lure. But even in Indian mythology, you will recall that we had famous apsaras who used to distract hermits and either get cursed or eventually lead to children being begotten who were themselves became gods later on, right? So this is the beauty, I think, of our different faiths, that we have many people who have drawbacks and complexities of character. And I think it's necessary for them to be accepted as they are, rather than infuse our own principles.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal. Mr. Balram Pandey, please ask your question live.
Good morning, sir. So my question is on the doctrine of essential practices only. So there was one question which was coming into my mind for quite some time when I read Shirur Math. So I see that American courts have usually tried to avoid sitting on judgments which were on religious error or religious truth, while the Indian Supreme Court has traveled in an opposite path, seeking to cleanse the religion of what it reads as superstition and providing it with other definitions of religious errors and religious truths. So now the question is like this judgment in Shirur Math, the majority rejected the American Supreme Court's judgment of BSN, and they sort of tried to they went with Article 25's interpretation, where Article 25 itself allows the state to regulate or restrict any economic, financial, or political, or any other secular activity. So what do you think that the judges have shaped the rationale of many religions, not only Hinduism? So will the constitutional bench, which is now deciding 9 questions of laws are there, how should we see and what should we expect from the court this time?
Well, I think, let me just read to you the Article 25 and give you the reason why I think there is relevance to the questions that have been framed by the Constitution bench now, and how it's different in the US. See, in the US, the First Amendment to the US Constitution explicitly says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's a straight prohibition. And that First Amendment is used constantly to ensure that states don't step in any way as far as religion is concerned. Article 25 says, subject to public order, morality and health, and to the other provisions of this part, which includes part 3. All persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience and the right freely to profess, practice and propagate religion. So it is subject to all these rights, and all those other rights have to be observed while you are practicing your own right under 25(1). And in 2, nothing in this article shall affect the operation of any existing law or prevent the state from making any law regulating or restricting economic, financial, political or other secular activity which may be associated with religious practice, and providing for social welfare and reform or throwing open of religious institutions of public character to all classes and sections of Hindus. So the Constitution itself specifically widely opens the door and says the state can come stumbling in and start making laws which are with reference to the secular financial aspects of the religion. It's because we are very conscious of the fact that unlike the one single state religion that the US had at the time of the First Amendment, here we have many religions, and we know that many of the religions are top heavy. They are controlled by certain people in certain sectors. And that's why the Indian constitution makers felt it's necessary for us to create a bit of a balance. It's necessary for the state to step in if exploitation is happening in the name of religion. So if you decide that the priest or the tantri or the archaka is going to get 95% of all contributions made, the state can step in and say, no, that's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. That's against the interests of your own religion, right? So that's the idea behind these, and that's why those aspects will be discussed, I think, threadbare when the matter is heard about what it means to say a secular aspect in 25(2)(a), right? So I think those questions are definitely large, and that it takes color from the explicit words in the Constitution as against the explicit words in the American Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal. Anjali Singhvi, please ask your question live.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the lecture. Sir, I was just curious, like we were talking about right to privacy, and we already have right to information. Do you think these two rights in one paradigm will go if favorable for the society in long run? Like we always talk that we have a right to information where we say that we need to know everything. But on the other hand, we say that everything needs to have reasonable restrictions. But do you think is that actually helpful for the society in a long run? Like, what's your opinion?
No, but these are essentially individual rights, right? So privacy is an individual right. So it is my right to privacy that I'm canvassing. Now, I don't see really a huge conflict between these two things, because if I choose to put something in the public domain, then that is available to a third party if it is held by a public authority, and that third party exercises his right to that information. So I don't see a conflict really. The RTI Act, in fact, specifically provides for third party information to be excluded. So the fact that we have a recognition of these two rights is good. What is necessary is we must ensure as wide a berth as possible for the full exercise of both rights. And I think especially with the RTI Act and the amendments that have come and the amendments that are proposed, I think there are going to be severe inroads into us exercising that right to information. So there's a lot of information that we have to get from our public authorities, and they are usually rebuffed on one count or another. So I think there have been inroads made into the right to information that we have. But I think it's a very good thing that we have these two rights and we can exercise them to the fullest.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal. Saurish, please ask your question live. Saurish.
Sir, good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to share your insights and thoughts. It's a good learning session for all of us. We are really very glad to have you. My question is with respect to the personal data protection bill. This was already raised by one of the queries earlier. So the bill is currently being considered by the Joint Parliamentary Committee, and I think it's taken a back burner because of the COVID issues that the government is trying to fight now. But what I noticed is while going through the bill that its provisions are extensive and give incisive rights to the government. And one of the examples of that is section 91(2) of the bill, which gives the central government the right to direct any data fiduciary or data processor to provide any personal data, anonymized or other non-personal data, to enable better targeting of delivery of services or formulation of evidence-based policies by the government. My question would be that would such a provision be an infringement to the right of privacy?
I think you need to have a provision like that depending on the objects of the action. Look, if you're saying that these provisions are to be read in isolation, I might disagree. Because many of these provisions have to be read in the context of the various other sections which are around them. So an anonymizing provision like this, we have to allow some elbow room to the central government. I think even the most rabid critics of the bill would not say that that discretion should not be available. I think that's the minimum modicum that we give to however egregious our government's actions have been. We must always allow that little leeway because it might be necessary in a particular circumstance. So I would not say that it's per se unconstitutional or illegal. Like I said before, each of these will have to be tested on the basis of the various parameters laid down in Puttaswamy. And so to see whether it's reasonable or to see whether it's proportional, we will have to compare it with what is being taken away and what safeguards are there for that, as against what ill is sought to be curbed. So I wouldn't say it's per se vulnerable just on the face of it. Almost all provisions, many provisions of the IT Act and the IT rules, I mean the regulations under it, also have omnibus provisions like this, giving the central government a little bit of elbow room.
Harshil Vasan, please ask your question live.
Good afternoon, sir. So now that we are discussing Article 25 and 26, and that essential religion practice test has also come into picture, I would like to ask a question. It might be a little long, but I want to suggest, it is my personal opinion that essential religious practices test is not something which the court initially wanted to adopt, but due to certain confusion and certain judges, that essential religious practice was ultimately adopted. So I want to know your views on it. So we have under 25 and 26, classically, we have three types of cases. One is where the government wants to regulate the secular aspects of a religion, the appointment of a priest or the taxation of a temple. So this is one type of case. The other type of case is where the government wants to regulate certain practices of a religion. So that is like excommunication. So excommunication is one practice which the Bombay government wanted to regulate back in 1970s. And the third type of case is the Sabrimala case, where there is essentially an internal practice which has external aspects and other fundamental rights of the people of the same religion. The first case is the Shirur Math case was essentially the first type of case where there was a distinction between what is religion and what is secular. So because secular activities could have been managed and regulated by the government, the religious activities could not be. So essentially the court had to ask itself a question that whether appointment of a priest or regulation of a temple is essentially religious or secular. But what the court essentially did was it took a paradigm shift from determining whether it is essentially religious to whether it is essential to the religion. So this was a big shift. So the question was not before the court whether it is essential to the religion, but to decide what is essentially religious. So court said that what will be essential to the religion, if it is found something in the, if it is found in the manuscripts of the religion, it will become religious, or else it will become secular. So in that regard, there have been same type of cases in the foreign jurisdictions, especially US. And I feel that the test they have adopted is a much better test. So there you are not actually concentrating on the right, fundamental right itself. You're concentrating on the restriction. So that is conventionally known as the Yoder-Sherbert test, wherein the US court had held that under the free exercise clause, the government cannot restrict religious beliefs or action unless the government demonstrated that it had a compelling interest at stake that could not be achieved in a less intrusive manner, which is something akin to the proportionality test under Article 21. So now you are not actually restricting the right itself, you are concentrating on the restriction. So you are asking the government to justify its restriction. If it has a compelling interest.
Mr. Harshil, have you completed your question?
Well, I think we
didn't
lost
get your question. Can you please put your question briefly? I think we've lost Mr. Harshil. Abhishek Kaushik, please ask your question live.
Hi, Gopal. It was,
hi.
It was
Hi,
nice listening to you for a long time. Most of the viewers do not know Gopal is the reason why we have a cleaner environment in Delhi. The ban on firecracker PIL is his brainchild through his own child. Now, my question is...
We've hardly made much impact, Abhishek, on that.
Now, the thing is that it's more of a discussion or a nuance. I am on the intermediaries' right and liabilities so far as internet defamations are concerned. It's a topic in this COVID situation which is gaining a lot of limelight, that our Information Technology Act, as it stands at the moment, doesn't address this issue in particular, where a person sitting in foreign jurisdiction starts defaming someone here, and then you have to go to a court of law for the purpose of getting a order to remove that post from the, say, Twitter or Facebook or for that matter. This is an aspect I would want you to highlight or discuss as to how to go about this.
Well, okay. This is free legal advice, Abhishek. So, what I feel is that's right. I mean, that's always a problem with the IT Act from its very inception, that we have not really managed to address two important issues. One is of jurisdiction and the other is of enforcement. In defamation cases particularly, if you have to sue, you're forced to then sue either ex parte against individuals who are not available here, and then you're not going to be able to enforce it. What I think many people are attempting to do now is getting the intermediary to at least geo-restrict the comment or the statement that has been made, so that it's not read in the jurisdictions or in the territories where the aggrieved person or the plaintiff is located. So if tomorrow somebody puts a defamatory statement out on Facebook, and that person is located, say, in Sweden, and you're in India, you could move a court in India and get an order against Facebook continuing to show that comment within the territory of India, because the court has the jurisdiction within India. So those are the best kind of ameliorative orders which are possible. If you look at it from a regulatory point of view, there isn't much you can do. We don't have an international regime which addresses this. Many countries have very varying views on the limits of free speech. So in the US, for example, it wouldn't be defamation at all. In India, we would treat it as defamatory. It could include criminal defamation as well. So, and in the UK, they fall somewhere in the middle. So to get a universally accepted norm for the intermediaries to follow is extremely difficult, even from the point of view of the intermediary. Because a comment made by one of billions of users in one jurisdiction may be perfectly legal and valid there, but it may not be to somebody somewhere else.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Madhukar Sharma, please ask your question live. This will be the last question, sir, a live question. And after this, I'll hand over to Raj to conclude.
Yeah.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Good morning.
So my question is pertains to the very topic nuances in advocacy. Rather, I have two questions. Number first, do the judges really read the file when they sit on the bench? And second is that when the judges take notice that this person, because it had happened with me before the CGI bench, that this person, because he is petitioner in person, he is not a practicing advocate as well. He just needs a push that he be given a space before he opens up, and before giving this opportunity to me, the bench immediately dismissed my petition. My SLP, it was a work of 3 years. I had invested around 50,000 rupees of my own in that particular matter. I just couldn't open just because of the fact that at my left hand side, Kapil Sibal sir was sitting. At my right hand side, Mr. Mukul Rohatgi sir was sitting, and I just couldn't open. And I am sure that the bench could take notice of this fact as well. The bench immediately dismissed my petition, despite of the fact that there was admission on behalf of the state that it was violating the law. So my two questions are that judges do really read the file before they sit on the bench, and the second, at such situation, what should be the approach of the judges?
Well, first, Mr. Sharma, let me extend my sympathies for what transpired with your case. I'm sorry that that happened, and I hope citizens are not similarly disappointed when they knock on the doors of our Supreme Court. Having said that, a majority of our judges, I mean almost all of them, read the briefs. This wasn't the case, say, about 20 years ago, but I've healthily seen that change. They do. They read the briefs. They won't be able to read from first page to end page. But with the levels of experience that they have, each of them have 35, 40 years under their belt. Even many of us, once we start reading a brief, we broadly have an idea, you know, where things are, what we are looking for, what's the heart of the case. So remember that these judges are sitting and hearing, in pre-COVID times, hearing nearly 60 cases for admission on Mondays and Fridays, and they're hearing 20 big final hearing matters on other days. So they have to have a broad grasp to ensure that all the people who are coming before them are happy that at least the judges have read their briefs. So I would believe that almost all our judges read the briefs. Most of our judges, nearly 70% of them, are frequently patient judges. They listen. Most of our chief justices are eventually, I think, because of the huge administrative burden, it's not a small thing, it's a humongous administrative burden that the chief justices of India as well as the chief justices of the high courts have to undertake. They are busy interviewing people for judgeship. They are interviewing staff for the Supreme Court. They have files to pass regarding the infrastructure. They have to make decisions on the administrative side with reference to larger benches, listing of reviews, curatives, etc. Apart from all their judicial work, I have seen over the years that when a judge goes from being judge number 2 to becoming Chief Justice of India, their patience really starts becoming tested. I think it's a normal human tendency. It's extremely difficult because they are usually at the receiving end of a lot of criticism for what the Supreme Court does. Many times justified, let me tell you. I'm not holding any brief for Chief Justices. I'm just telling you that in many times it's justified, but many times it's not. But they are the ones who are bearing the brunt of a lot of that. So their patience is really, really frayed and tested. So they will try and wrap up their boards in the quickest manner possible. They would have broadly read it and deal with it. Now, with petitioners in person, such as yourself, I think you may be, I don't think it will be the fairest thing for you to expect them to give you more time than they give any other advocate. It's a choice you made to be the petitioner and come yourself without engaging a lawyer. Not all lawyers cost as much as Mr. Sibal and Mr. Rohatgi. Not all lawyers are going to try and swindle you out. And many lawyers would be able to, even pro bono, come and represent you in court. But if a petitioner feels that he or she has the skill set when the case is called out to be able to present that case, then unfortunately you have to face the consequences of it. Let me assure you that as lawyers, all of us have faced summary dismissals like that in many cases, in hundreds of cases, We barely stood up. The judges felt that there's nothing in it, and it's a bench. So 2 or 3 judges have felt that there's nothing in it. You look around hoping that one of the other judges will disagree and say something in your favor, but if they don't, then hard luck. It's unfortunate that it had to happen to you, but that's broadly my view about what the institution is.
Thank you, sir. To all the attendees, we really apologize. In the interest of time, we will not be able to take any further live questions. I hope we have a follow-up session with Mr. Gopal soon. We haven't seen this flood of questions ever, Mr. Gopal. Raj, over to you to conclude the session now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Akshay.
One sec, before you speak. I had at the outset told Raj that I'm going to touch upon 4 cases. I really touched upon only 2. I had actually a bunch to say about the CAA and the NRC issues, as well as on Article 370, Kashmir, etc., and about the nuances which are there in those 2. That's obviously going to wait for another date, because I think a lot of the questioning arises now on aspects of law and stuff like that. But I'm happy that we managed to get that far. Go on, Raj. Sorry.
Indeed, sir, and I think we will take a second session with you in one of the next weekends. So, so one of the because time is of the constraint, so we'll take quickly 2 more questions, and then I will we'll give the mic to Professor Ravande. So one question is of a participant, Asim Atwal. He mentions that since you have mentioned in the beginning of the webinar that Sabrimala issue should have been left out since it's a private religious practice, then shouldn't, in the same manner, the triple talaq issue should have been left out?
There's a difference between those 2, isn't there? Because Sabrimala is dealing with religious practices with reference to entry into a place of worship. That's where the court is stepping into the place of worship and very squarely into what is prescribed by the religion or the followers of the religion in administering it. But triple talaq is where religion has stepped out from places of worship, walked into somebody's home and said that this is how you will carry on your civil association with a person of the opposite gender, and made it entirely summary. Remember that many aspects of that then are affected with reference to the right of the Muslim woman to property, the right of the children born out of that marriage. All of that gets affected, apart from her own right of dignity, etc., as a person, because marriage is a civil union, and in Muslim law it's a contract. So there are those very clear non-religious aspects of it which come into play. There's nothing very clearly non-religious that comes into play with reference to a Hindu woman wanting, or a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian woman wanting to enter a place of worship.
Thank you, sir, for answering the question. I'll take the last question, which is just a small question, and it's Mr. Shubham Arya. He says that we see that legal ethics are diminishing to a great extent amongst young lawyers, and what would be your advice to the budding lawyers and students who are about to become lawyers to rebuild the legal ethics, sir?
My view is the exact opposite. I think legal ethics have been forgotten by many of our senior lawyers. I think it's been forgotten for many years. In their greed, their avarice for money, in their avarice to join politics and project political positions in court, in their avarice for self-aggrandizement, they have forgotten that they are examples for junior lawyers across the board. I have repeatedly found people who claim to be self-professed mentors and guides in the profession, turning around and embarrassing young lawyers in court by pointing fingers at them and saying, young people nowadays. That's rubbish. There are, if you look up to the elders in the profession, I'm sad to say that I find it very hard to find even 1 or 2 who could dare to be the heroes that we look for. I'm in fact very happy with the youngsters in our profession today and the young students that I engage with on a regular basis. Their levels of knowledge, their level of awareness, their level of what is right and wrong is in spades far ahead of the so-called big guns of the profession. So in fact, I think we spend too much time in trying to keep reminding them of what they should be. I think it's much easier to point out to these failures and say, please, they may be rich, they may be famous, but just don't become like them. I think it's important for us to understand that we are representatives of a profession which has dignity foremost. Don't genuflect and beg and crawl before judges. Don't genuflect and beg and crawl before seniors in the profession. Have the dignity to be your own man or woman, and please understand that there's somebody entrusting their lives in many cases and their interests to you. You have to do the best by them in the fairest manner possible. And Raj, we have discussed this before, if you remember, about criminal prosecutions. Remember that if any of you are ever in a position of power, where you are representing the state in a prosecutorial position, remember to be fair. It's not necessary that you have to always send the guy to jail. If you feel you don't have the evidence, just stand up and say, I'm sorry, I don't think a case is made out. Have the dignity to do that. That's what really, really makes you a true professional. In the words of Abraham Lincoln, a great lawyer and a very great president himself, he said, you know the true character of a man when you give him power. I think that is a true test to always hold when you have a question of ethics knocking on your door. Remember that if you're in a position of power, be most graceful. And that in itself will be a guide for you in life.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. And we just ran out of time now. And thank you so much for such an intense lecture. And I think we have 20 unattended questions, which we will answer to the participants individually. So, sir, now I'll quickly invite our mentor, Dr. C.J. Rawandale, sir, Professor, to extend the concluding remarks, after which my colleague and co-host, Mr. Kumar Mihir, will extend the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gopal. It was a pleasure hearing your talk, and I could see the kind of awareness you raised and so many questions. I would not say bombarded, but I would say that they are seem to be very jealous questions. I would just take 2 minutes. Yeah. So today's talk was more about two rights, and those rights are again individual rights. To begin with was right to privacy and then right to religion. Well, this question does not come to anybody's mind what we are practicing, because when we define right, we say it is inherent in us, but religion was never inherent in us. We just took birth in a family. That family is practicing something referred as a religion, and I just obeyed or I followed. But when it comes to other rights, like right to me, that is right of movement, I learned it myself when I was growing as a child. I learned what is right to life, what I like. I learned it my own way, and I was corrected when I was not doing it what society likes. So that takes us back. I am a strong believer, rather, I believe in the sociological school of jurisprudence, because it balances all three interests which are prevalent in. One is the individual interest, then the second is the social interest, and last is the state interest. It is very well said by someone, and I created this, that the whole dispute is of Vyakti, Abhivyakti and Adhikar. That is nothing but I, me and myself. We should remain I. We should not progress to my or myself, and that's where the dispute comes. So when it comes to religion, it is I, and I still believe that Pandit Nehru was the correct when he said about religion, it's a way of life. I like this way of life. I do not disturb anybody, then I should be allowed to do that. That is again, Professor, means if you go for Professor Mill, harms principle, and then we get into unless it harms somebody, one should be allowed to do that. Unless it has repercussions on others, one should be allowed to do that. It's very simple. Where that freeness has gone, we have given it up under the burden of a word. We have coined another word called freedom. We have forgotten freeness. We have come to freedom, but truly now everybody is using it to doom freely anything else which is happening. So freedom is cited by somebody as it is very important for me, but we are forgetting others. So we all need to, now religion, when someone said, this is the only right which starts with subject to, rest of the fundamental rights don't begin with subject to. And there are 3 specific and 4th one also follows. And if you see that word is public health, public morality, public order, and then other parts, other provisions of part 3 of the Constitution. So they have said religion. Religion should not be used by anybody, be it state. State has used religion to regulate relations, not govern relations. And we got rid of it. Religion was the state earlier. Now just look at the state we call the secular state. I'll not get into it. Now individuals are bringing it as a reason to control different relations. I think we need to control that aspect as well. Because it is very simple. Liberty without security is a myth. And where do you find security? Security lies within you. How you do things. If you do not cause trouble to other will never feel insecure. And the Puttaswamy judgment, or we talk about, well, somebody made reference to Shah Bano, etc. Like, if you go in detail in the judgment as well, well, there was another control mechanism which was devised. How do we bring all religions under one umbrella? Well, which was later on said to be the Obaicher dicta by the judges in that specific case. I'll not get into whether I'm for uniform civil code or not. But again, we see nowadays that religion has been used as a coin to control, regulate relations. And I think that is something which we all have to be very careful, cautious in our approach. Religion must be treated as a way of life. It should not be mingled by us to regulate the relations with others. Let it be a personal freedom. Let us not make it a social freedom or a state freedom. And I think that's where sometimes we go. And as rightfully you said, even Anand Prasad, he also delivered a lecture on the Sabrimala judgment. So he talked about, what are we talking about? We are talking about a custom which has been followed. How does it prohibit others? Just focus on what it is a deity, what is a religion, etc. if we do not. So without understanding nowadays, people are just making comments, and I think people do not have to set out their opinions, do not have to comment, but people have to realize the thing and then say things. And truly speaking, as you rightfully said, we as professionals, we state things, we don't say things. And statement is always based on fact. And nowadays, if we forget the fact, there is nothing called statement. We just say, and it becomes hearsay, and law itself says it is not evidence, so it has no sense. So you rightfully said it, and this is what I could derive from it. And thank you very much for the session. And it was good to hear that someone speaks on said to be what is called controversial. I don't believe in that word only. There is nothing called controversial. And this is my strong belief, Mr. Gopal and the audience, that nowadays we all suffer from the syndrome. That I am saying that we all, means I'm including myself. I should get noticed. Why should one get noticed? I really do not know. My work should get noticed. And that's the problem lies. So law should get noticed, not the one who is defending. Why do you require law to be defended? Law is there to defend us. We don't have to defend the law, and we have forgotten this basic sentiment or tenement of law. And that's where the work also needs to be done. And good that we have wonderful souls like you. And as you rightfully said, I strongly believe in the young ones, because their minds are open, their minds are free. They may say things you dislike, but they say things which you never have thought about. And I think we have to be open about, and that's what you one of, and that's why you are the youngest. The youngest one to become the senior. And you could see that, yes, the senior ones also are realizing that fact. That's why the youngest one has become the senior designate as well. So we give credit, the part of the share of the credit to them as well. And to young individuals, like we have 2 advocates on record who are, well, I'm their proud teacher, and we have many who are in the audience as well, you know, and it is good to see they're growing. And yes, they troubled me during the college days, but that trouble has not gone anywhere, because that made me learn what I am today. So I have learned from them. Whether they have learned from me or not, that is different, but I have learned from them. I think we have to begin with I, forget me and myself, and I think everything would be all right. So thank you very much, Mr. Gopa, for the session. I really enjoyed the session. Thank you. Thank you very much, and we'll have another session with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ravandale, for the deep reflection on many issues. In fact, including, like you said at the end, about the individualistic I, and the fact that we dub things so quickly as controversial without really delving into them. I'm very, very happy that all of you gave me this opportunity. I love to reach out and speak. I think this is a problem that many of us lawyers have, which is of loving to hear our own voices. But I think sometimes we like to share our experiences, because there are so many mistakes that we've made and we continue to make. And I feel and I fear that we don't share those mistakes often, that other people don't have to go through the same pitfalls that we did. So it's just unfortunate that we couldn't address the other issues. And I just quickly went through some of the questions that are still pending, etc. Very interesting ones. I'm sorry that I couldn't address them all right now. And I have great faith in, they're almost my generation, Raj and Kumar and the others. I have very, very great faith. I've seen the way they conduct themselves in court. And I'm so proud of the fact that they're not the kind of servile individuals that I've seen in previous generations who try to project themselves and move forward. They're very happy to have their work do the talking. And I'm really very, very optimistic that in the years to come, there will be a perceptible shift in the manner in which the bar functions at the court, and it's all in their hands. And thank you all very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the kind words. And we realize that you've only covered half the topic, so we'll definitely schedule another webinar with you to listen completely what you have to say. Thank you for a very inspiring and enlightening web lecture today. I want to thank our supporters, the Lex Witness magazine, THS, the law firm, and Sadgamaya Group for giving us this opportunity to have this webinar. I would also like to thank my alma mater, Symbiosis Law School, and my teacher, whom we have troubled a lot, as he mentioned, Professor Ravandale, for giving us this opportunity to have this webinar and to be the moderators of this. I want to thank my friend Raj for inviting you and moderating the session. And lastly, I want to thank all the participants for registering and raising the questions which we got to hear the answers to. I would request all the participants to register and attend tomorrow's session as well. And if anyone wants to revisit and see the video of today's session, it's available on the YouTube channel of Symbiosis Law School. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Thanks again, Gopal sir.
Thank you.